The Division 2 is one of many recent entries into the looter shooter space, but what separates the Division 2 from other looter shooters is that it's actually pretty damn good. This game manages to do what games like Anthem, Destiny, and others have really failed to do and make a satisfying gameplay loop around building a stronger character and getting better loot. Let's start with the overall gameplay. The Division 2 is a cover-based shooter at its core, and it emphasizes this fact, the fragility of your character. It's very different in that regard from the Division 1, where cover really wasn't that big a deal. It only takes a few bullets for enemies to down you, which forces you to play a fairly conservative style around cover. It helps that the AI design is not too bad either. They do a really decent job of trying to constantly push at you and flank you out of position, which forces you to use spatial awareness to keep yourself from getting caught off guard. Pushing too far forward is an easy way to die, as enemies will just push all around you and begin to surround you. Sometimes the enemies do some dumb things like rushing out in front of you or simply bugging out, and I've seen that happen a lot, and just standing there, but for the most part I found the AI was definitely better than your average shooter. They seem to do a decent job at least forcing the AI to push forward and try and surround you. And it also helps that your character is so fragile that it makes it very difficult sometimes to survive when you're being just surrounded by these hordes of enemies. Bullet sponges are always a difficult issue with loot shooters. Given the RPG nature of these games, you always need some sort of bullet sponges, especially for boss fights, but when enemies are too strong, it can leave a really unsatisfying experience. Especially if you're using modern weapons, it doesn't feel good to lay down tons of bullets and then just have a guy not even fall at all. But for the most part, the Division 2 actually plays it pretty well. When enemies are being shot at, they do die fairly quickly for the most part, and shooting weak spots like heads or certain areas like the flame packs in the back of flamethrowers or pouches that might have grenades that a soldier is carrying around can explode and help speed up the time to kill. The enemies that do have a lot of health generally look like they take a long time to kill because they're wearing massive bulletproof vests and thick armor. You can focus down certain parts of the armor as well, like I mentioned earlier, that will help break apart different armor pieces that will make the enemies actually die quicker, which helps. The combat itself has a decent amount of options with LMGs, SMGs, assault rifles, pistols, shotguns, and sniper rifles to choose from. You can also carry two different skills with options like drones that can run up and explode on contact, or healing skills that send out a little bot to heal or repair allies or yourself, or you can throw out revive grenades to revive downed allies, and skills that can also reduce the armor of enemies, making them more easy to kill. I like the skills, but I do wish the cooldown was a little bit lower on some of them. You can get some mods later on that help with this, but this game kind of has some of the same problems that Destiny 2 has, where the abilities take so long to use that oftentimes you just don't even get to really use them that much. Massive has done a wonderful job with the Division 2's locations and graphics. Washington, D.C. is incredibly detailed and has a real sense of creepiness as you wander the empty streets of D.C. It's one of the better examples of open world gameplay. When you start the game, you're dropped into the world and set out to reclaim it from different factions that are occupying it. Each area has different outposts that you can fight to claim in both main missions and side missions. Surprisingly, the side missions don't feel at all like side missions. They have their own interesting stories, and most of them are fairly long in length. You also find hostage situations and other random events, like you'll try and disable a propaganda post or take a control point. It's a game where I found myself constantly wandering off from the main mission and side content just because I was so interested to see what was going on with this side stuff. Progression is one area where the Division 2 suffers a little bit. It takes around 15 to 20 plus hours to reach the max level, and once you do, the game gets significantly better than it was before. A new faction shows up called the Black Tusk, and I know I'm kind of spoiling a little bit, but I have to use this to kind of explain the game's mechanics a little bit, because they are significantly more difficult than the normal enemies you'll be fighting. The map changes as well, and it becomes more of a push and pull as the AI can now fight back and claim the settlements you take over. You'll also gain access to 3 new specializations that give you access to signature weapons like a special sniper rifle and a skill tree to develop your character. I find it really odd that this system takes so long to get into the game. It makes the game so much better when you can actually sort of specialize your character and put down a skill tree system, because otherwise you're basically just leveling for the sake of leveling. You're not really getting to develop your character in a way that you want. You don't really get any interesting options. And so I don't know why they gate this system so far into the game, because it's significantly more interesting than the first 30 or so levels. They really should speed those up if they're going to keep this system and then get you to that point faster. Another thing I don't like about the Division 2 is the crazy amount of bugs. There's all sorts of bugs, and it feels like every single patch introduces a new bug. There's just so many random bugs, like where weapons don't work, or abilities don't work, or your character T-poses, or just all sorts of nonsense that continues to happen all the time. PvP is another area I don't really like about the Division 2 very much. It's just bland. There's your more traditional deathmatch type of game modes called Control, and it's pretty boring, to be honest with you. It just doesn't lend itself well to that style of gameplay. There's also the Dark Zones, or DZs, which are a carryover from Division 1. Basically, it's sort of like a free-for-all PvP area where you can go in there, you can kill other players, take their loot, and then run off with it. There's sort of a timer where when you get a special piece of loot, you have to extract it in the DZ. You can't just like walk out and use it anywhere else or just use it right away. You have to extract it through a helicopter that'll come after a certain amount of time and pick it up. But it's not a particularly fun mechanic because there just isn't really anything to do in the DZ that makes it all worthwhile. The loot is not particularly good, and going rogue doesn't really add any interesting benefits because I never really found like I was getting much good loot at all from people. So it just feels like a pretty wasted mechanic, which is a disappointment because it's such a core, interesting feature of the Division that sets it apart from everything else, but the DZs in this one are just too dang small. There's just not enough to do in them or any interesting loot to pick up. Overall, the Division 2 gets an 8 out of 10. It's a really good looter shooter. I think at its core, the core gameplay loop is a lot of fun, and it blows every other loot shooter out of the water, hands down. Like, there's just nothing that comes anywhere near close. But it has some issues. You know, the story just isn't particularly interesting. The characters are pretty bland. They don't really talk to you or do anything. They just kind of ramble off on monologues that have nothing to do really with anything you're doing. It's just kind of boring to listen to. And there is issues with the progression systems I mentioned earlier where it doesn't really feel like you're able to progress your character until you get to level 30 where you get these specializations and other things, but despite these problems, I still think the Division 2 is a really good game. It's very satisfying combat, there's a ton of content here. If you want to just wander around and spend like a good 40 hours playing a game, this is your game. There's just so much to do in it. The graphics are fantastic, and it's one of the better cities I've ever seen rendered in a game before. Overall, I'd highly recommend it to loot shooter fans, but if you're looking for an interesting story, you probably want to stay away because this game just isn't that good from a story perspective.